Everyone around you seems to be searching, swiping, dating, hoping, settling, caught in this quiet panic that if they don't find someone soon, they'll have missed something essential about being human. And then there's you, not searching, not waiting, not searching, not waiting, not secretly devastated about it, just done. Maybe you tried it. Maybe you watched it up close and decided it wasn't worth the cost. Maybe you simply realized one ordinary day that you felt more like yourself alone than you ever did trying to fit inside someone else's life. Society calls that a problem. Psychologists are starting to call it something else entirely, because the decision to live outside of romantic partnership, intentionally, consciously, without apology, isn't emptiness. It's a psychological position, and it's one of the most misunderstood ones in modern life. Here's what nobody says out loud. The people who are most comfortable being single, genuinely comfortable, not pretending, are often the ones who understand love the most clearly, not because they've never felt it, but because they have, deeply. And they know the difference between the real thing and a version of it that just looks right on the outside. You're not afraid of love. You're afraid of a counterfeit, of building something that feels hollow but is supposed to feel like home. Most people will settle quietly rather than stay alone loudly. You chose differently. That's not damage. That's discernment. You're not someone who can't commit. You're someone who can't commit. You're someone who refuses to commit to the wrong thing. And that distinction changes everything. You've been there before. You showed up fully, emotionally present, genuinely trying, giving the kind of love most people only talk about, and from the outside, it probably looked right. The relationship made sense on paper, people approved. Maybe you even convinced yourself for a while, but something underneath never settled. Not resentment, not indifference, just a quiet, persistent feeling like you were slowly becoming someone you didn't recognize. Like the closer you got, the further you drifted from yourself. And then you noticed something that confused you deeply. Being alone felt more like you than being together ever did. That's not failure. That's not coldness. That's your sense of self trying to survive. And it deserves to be understood, not fixed. And then there was that one morning, you probably remember it, even if you've never put words to it. You woke up alone, and the apartment was quiet. No one to check on. No text to answer before your feet even hit the floor. No emotional temperature to read before you'd had your coffee. You made your coffee. You sat with it. And somewhere in that silence, something in you exhaled. Not from sadness. Not from resignation. From relief. And that feeling confused you, didn't it? Because you'd been taught that waking up alone meant something was missing. But that morning, nothing felt missing. Everything felt like yours. That was the moment. Not a breakup. Not a breakdown, just an ordinary Tuesday that quietly told you the truth. You don't just tolerate solitude, you come alive in it. Here's what most people never get told. Your body knows the difference between feeling safe and performing safe. Dr. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, described how the autonomic nervous system constantly scans the environment, not for what you think, but for what it feels. And for some people, certain relational dynamics, the constant negotiation, the emotional monitoring, the invisible labor of being known, register as low-level stress. Not because anything is wrong, not because the person beside them is wrong, just because the nervous system is telling the truth that the mind keeps second-guessing. Solitude for you isn't escapism, it's regulation. Your nervous system isn't broken, it's precise, it's been trying to tell you something for years. And maybe, finally, it's time to listen to it instead of apologize for it. Nobody decides to be alone, not really. It happens earlier than that, quieter than that. Think back. Maybe love in your house came with conditions attached. Maybe keeping the peace meant making yourself smaller. Maybe you watched the people closest to you lose themselves inside relationships. Their joy, their opinions, their sense of self, all slowly traded away for the sake of staying. And somewhere in that observation, without anyone sitting you down and explaining it, you made a decision. Not consciously, but deeply. This is too high a price. Attachment theory tells us that our earliest relational experiences become the template for every connection that follows. When love felt conditional, when closeness consistently required self-erasure, the nervous system files that away as a warning, not an invitation. So you didn't end up single because something is wrong with you. You ended up here because something in you was paying attention. That's not a wound. That's wisdom. There's a difference between being alone because you're afraid and being single because you're free. And that distinction is everything. Fear-based solitude contracts. It shrinks your world down to what feels safe, what feels manageable, what won't hurt you. You stay single not because you want to, but because connection feels like a risk you haven't found the courage for yet. That's real, and it deserves compassion. But that's not what this is about. Because there's another kind of alone, the kind that expands, the kind where you look at certain relationships, certain compromises, certain versions of yourself you'd have to become, and you say, quietly but clearly, not that, not smaller, not that direction. People who genuinely thrive in their singleness aren't closing doors. They're refusing to walk through doors that lead somewhere smaller than where they already are. That's not avoidance. That's not fear wearing a confident mask. That is autonomy. That is self-authorship. That is the radical act of knowing what you're worth and refusing to negotiate it down just because the world has a timeline it wants you to follow. Society has handed you a vocabulary for this that doesn't fit. Lonely, guarded, afraid of intimacy. But those words belong to a different story. Yours needs a different language. Freedom, intention, expansion. The quiet confidence of someone who has built something real inside themselves and isn't willing to demolish it just to fill a seat at someone else's table. You're not closed off. You're just finally open to yourself. So let's say it clearly. Staying single isn't giving up on love. It's refusing to dilute it. You are not someone who couldn't make it work. You are someone who refused to make yourself smaller just to make it fit. There's a profound difference between those two things, and most people never stop long enough to see it. You love deeply. Anyone who knows you knows that. You show up for people. You feel things fully. You just won't pour that into something that doesn't honor it in return. Psychologists describe this level of self-awareness as a form of emotional intelligence, the ability to know your own needs clearly enough to protect them. That's not avoidance. That's not fear. That's precision. You didn't build this life by accident. You built it because you know who you are, not approximately, exactly. And that is not a consolation prize. That is the whole point. Not everyone finds themselves through another person. Some people find themselves first, in the quiet, in the solitude, in the long, honest conversation they finally had with themselves. That's not a consolation prize. That's the destination. You were never broken for wanting space. You were never cold for needing silence. You were someone learning the shape of your own life before handing any of it to someone else. You don't need to be fixed. You need to be understood. And maybe, after all of this, you understand yourself a little more clearly now. If this felt like something you needed to hear, share it with someone who needs it too.